Hospitals don't fix broken families. They expose them. When both twins collapsed into complete meltdown simultaneously, Marcus Webb realized everything he'd built. His empire, his confidence, his hope, was crumbling. But the real shock came after. A discovery so devastating it changed everything he thought he knew about the woman who saved his sons. Before we dive in, comment below where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Marcus Webb had everything money could buy. He was a venture capitalist with a portfolio that spanned technology, real estate, and pharmaceuticals. At 42, he commanded boardrooms with the confidence of someone who had never lost a negotiation that mattered. His penthouse overlooked the city. His cars were custom-built. His net worth was measured in the hundreds of millions. Yet none of it meant anything when he looked at his twin sons. The boys, Daniel and Isaiah, were 12 years old. They hadn't spoken a single word since their mother died 10 years ago. She had been there one day, laughing with them at breakfast, and then a car accident took her away before dinner. The boys had been 2 years old, too young to understand death, old enough to feel the abandonment. For a decade, Marcus had watched them exist in a world without sound. They communicated through gestures, through pointing, through stares that held more emotion than any words could convey, but they never spoke. Not to him, not to anyone. Doctors said they had autism spectrum disorder. Specialists suggested selective mutism. Therapists offered theories about trauma and grief. Marcus had heard them all. He'd paid for the best ones, the ones with credentials from prestigious universities and waiting lists a mile long. He'd built them sensory rooms with soft lighting and carefully curated textures. He'd hired speech therapists who came 3 times a week. He'd purchased communication devices that cost thousands of dollars. The boys ignored all of it. They moved through the penthouse like ghosts, present but unreachable. Daniel liked to arrange his toys in straight lines. Isaiah hummed sometimes, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and lonely. Marcus watched them and felt something he'd never felt in business. Complete failure. The penthouse was designed to be impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Modern art hung on white walls. The kitchen was state-of-the-art. Rooms had been converted into therapy spaces with expensive equipment. And yet the space felt cold, hollow, like a museum where 2 small boys lived behind glass. Marcus had decorated their rooms carefully. Soft colors, comfortable furniture, toys organized by type. But organization didn't create comfort. Money didn't create connection. The boys spent most of their time in the living room, sitting on the large sectional sofa, staring out at the city or at nothing at all. They existed in proximity to each other, without really interacting. They didn't fight. They didn't laugh. They didn't reach for each other. They just were. Marcus had made a decision years ago to step back from most of his business responsibilities. He attended important meetings, made critical decisions, but left the day-to-day operations to trusted lieutenants. His focus was supposed to be on the boys, but focus didn't translate to connection. He was present. He was paying attention. But something crucial was missing. Something no amount of money could purchase. He spoke to them every morning. He asked about their dreams, if they'd slept well, what they might like for breakfast. They never responded. He tried different approaches. Some mornings he sat in silence beside them, thinking maybe words were part of the problem. Other mornings he played music, thinking perhaps melody could reach places that language couldn't. Nothing worked. The silence was absolute. One afternoon, when Marcus was in a video call with his business partner discussing a potential acquisition, the boys had a meltdown in the next room. The sound of them screaming, throwing objects, wailing in a language only they seemed to understand, filled the penthouse. Marcus excused himself from the call and rushed to find Daniel on the floor, gasping for breath, his body rigid. Isaiah was pressed against the corner of his bedroom, rocking back and forth, his hands over his ears. The maid at the time, a woman named Sandra, stood helplessly in the doorway. Marcus had to use all his strength to hold Daniel while the boy fought against him. It took 2 hours for both of them to calm down. By then, it was evening. Marcus sat between their beds, watching them sleep, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy. He had built an empire with his mind. He'd outmaneuvered competitors and closed deals that seemed impossible. But he couldn't reach his own children. He couldn't give them what they needed. By evening of the next day, Sandra had quit. She left a note on the kitchen counter saying she couldn't handle the stress. Marcus understood. He didn't blame her. He had called an agency and requested a replacement. Over the past 3 years, there had been 5 different maids. Some lasted weeks. A few made it to a month. None of them stayed. They all left with some version of the same excuse. The environment was too challenging. The boys were too difficult. The pay wasn't worth the emotional toll. Marcus accepted it. He didn't argue. He wrote checks for their severance and called the agency again. The cycle had become routine. A new person would arrive, full of hope and determination. They would try to clean while managing the boys' needs. And within days or weeks, they would crumble under the weight of it. The latest maid had been there for 3 days. Her name was Amara. She was in her mid-40s, tall with dark eyes that held something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Sadness, maybe. Experience. When he'd interviewed her, she'd been straightforward about her qualifications. She had worked as a caregiver before. She'd managed difficult situations. She knew the pay was modest for the work required. She understood there were 2 boys with special needs. She had asked only one question during the entire interview. Are they good kids? Marcus had answered yes without hesitation. Daniel and Isaiah were good. They were scared and trapped in their own minds, but they were fundamentally good. Amara had nodded and accepted the job. On her 3rd morning, Marcus watched her move through the penthouse with an economy of motion he hadn't seen in the other maids. She didn't seem rushed. She didn't seem frustrated. She cleaned methodically, her movements smooth and practiced. She avoided the boys without ignoring them. When Isaiah wandered into the kitchen where she was organizing dishes, she didn't try to interact with him. She simply continued her work, humming very softly, something that sounded old and familiar. The boy stood in the doorway for several minutes, then left. An hour later, Marcus noticed Isaiah sitting in the hallway outside the kitchen, not close, but closer than he normally got to the other staff members. Amara finished her work without acknowledging him. She didn't smile or wave or try to be friendly. She just existed in the space with him, and somehow that seemed to matter. By the afternoon, Marcus was standing in his home office working on the laptop when he heard something that made him freeze. It was music, soft and low, humming that seemed to be coming from Isaiah. The boy was in the living room, standing by the window, and he was humming the same melody that Amara had been singing. Marcus put down his laptop. He walked quietly to the living room and stood in the doorway. Isaiah didn't see him. The boy was completely focused on replicating the tune, his small voice tentative but present. It was the most engaged Marcus had seen his son in months. When the humming stopped, Isaiah turned and looked directly at his father. For just a moment, there was connection in that gaze. Then the boy looked away and returned to his position by the window. Marcus went back to his office feeling something unfamiliar, a small spark of hope. That evening, when Amara was preparing to leave for the day, Marcus found himself in the kitchen with her. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. Thank you seemed insufficient. Instead, he found himself asking a question. Did you have children? Amara looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold entire stories. She answered slowly. I did. Past tense was clear in her voice. Marcus didn't ask more. Some silences held boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But as she left the penthouse, he found himself thinking about the humming, about the way Isaiah had responded to it, and about the person behind it. He decided then that he would give Amara more time than he'd given the others. The next morning, Marcus woke with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He needed to understand what Amara was doing differently. He watched her as she moved through her work, paying attention to every interaction, or lack thereof, with the boys. What he observed was subtle, but significant. When Daniel arranged his toys in lines, Amara didn't try to interrupt or redirect him. She worked around him, respecting his space and his ritual. When Isaiah looked anxious at the sound of a truck outside, she didn't try to calm him or distract him. She simply sat quietly nearby, her presence a kind of anchor. She spoke very little. Her voice was always soft. She never made sudden movements. She seemed to understand instinctively the things that triggered the boys' distress, and she avoided all of them. Most importantly, she didn't demand anything from them. The other maids had all made the same mistake. They had tried. They had attempted to engage the boys, to help them, to reach them. They had offered toys and kindness and attention. The boys had rejected it all with screams and meltdowns. But Amara offered nothing except her quiet presence. And something about that quiet presence seemed to be working. On the 5th day, Marcus saw Isaiah follow Amara into the hallway. The boy didn't touch her or speak to her. He simply walked behind her as she carried laundry to the bedroom. When she reached the room, she didn't acknowledge him. She went about her task. When she was done, she left. Isaiah stayed in the hallway, standing in the exact spot where she had been. Marcus felt his chest tighten. It was such a small thing, following someone down a hallway. But for his son, it represented a bridge being built across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable. That evening, Marcus did something he rarely did. He asked Amara to sit with him. Not in the formal dining room. In the living room where the light was soft and the space was comfortable. She sat on the edge of a chair, her posture respectful, as though she was still working. Marcus tried to find the right words. "What are you doing differently?" Amara was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "I'm not trying to fix them." That simple statement contained more wisdom than all the therapy sessions and specialist consultations had offered. Marcus waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed to think she'd said enough. "Can you explain what you mean?" Amara looked out the window at the city lights spreading out below them. "In my experience, children who have experienced trauma or pain, they can feel when someone is trying to fix them. They feel like projects, like problems to be solved." She paused. "But when you just exist with them, when you respect their space, when you don't demand anything, when you accept them as they are, that's different. That allows trust to build." Marcus had paid teams of specialists hundreds of thousands of dollars who hadn't articulated this truth as clearly as Amara just had. "Where did you learn this?" Amara stood up. She didn't answer the question directly. She said, "I should finish the laundry before I leave." Marcus nodded. He watched her leave the room, understanding that some stories were private. But as she left, he felt something shift, for the first time in years. He believed his sons might be reachable. The belief was fragile, barely formed, but it existed. Over the next 2 weeks, changes began to manifest. Small ones at first. Daniel started to look at Amara as she passed through the rooms. Isaiah began to position himself closer to wherever she was working. Neither boy had spoken, but their awareness of her presence seemed to grow. Marcus noticed that when Amara was in the penthouse, the boys' anxiety levels decreased. They had fewer meltdowns. They seemed calmer, more present. One afternoon, Isaiah wandered into the kitchen where Amara was preparing lunch. She was making a sandwich, her movements slow and deliberate. The boy stood in the doorway and watched. After several minutes, he made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was more like a questioning hum, a reaching out through vocalization. Amara turned to look at him. She didn't smile or react with excessive emotion. She hummed back, the same melody from before. Isaiah's eyes widened. He hummed again, slightly different, a variation. Amara hummed that variation back to him. For 5 minutes, they created a conversation in melody. It was the most engaging interaction Marcus had seen his son have with anyone other than his brother since their mother died. When it ended, Isaiah left the kitchen, but he was visibly calmer, and later that evening, Marcus heard him humming the melody to himself in his bedroom. The following week, something more dramatic happened. Marcus was in his office when he heard a sound that made him jump out of his chair. It was a word. A single word, spoken by a child's voice. The word was juice. Marcus ran out of the office. In the kitchen, Daniel was standing in front of Amara, and the boy was pointing at the refrigerator. His mouth was forming the word again. Juice. Juice. It was simple and imperfect, the pronunciation not quite right, but it was undeniably language. It was undeniably a request. Amara responded without overreacting. She opened the refrigerator, poured juice into a cup, and handed it to him. Daniel took it and drank. It was the most normal, natural thing he'd done in a decade. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. He stood in the hallway, unseen, watching this ordinary moment that represented 10 years of hope finally breaking through. When Amara saw him, she simply nodded. She didn't celebrate or make a big deal of it. But her dark eyes held recognition. They both understood the significance of what had just happened. That evening, Marcus sat with the boys during dinner. They ate in silence, as they always did. But the silence felt different now. It felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of absence. He studied his sons, trying to see if anything had fundamentally shifted in their faces or their bodies. They looked the same, but something was changing inside them. He could feel it. After dinner, Marcus found Amara preparing to leave for the day. He handed her an envelope. She opened it and looked at the check inside. Her eyes widened. "This is too much," she said. "It's a bonus. For what you're doing with them." Amara shook her head. "I'm just doing my job." Marcus understood then that this wasn't about money for her. If it had been, she would have taken the bonus and forgotten the boys ever existed. But something in her response, the genuine refusal, suggested she was invested in a way that transcended payment. "Why did you really take this job?" Marcus asked. Amara looked at him directly. She seemed to be making a decision about what to share. "I had a daughter once," she said. "She needed help and I couldn't give it to her. There were reasons, circumstances, mistakes, but I couldn't be what she needed. I've spent a long time trying to understand what that means. When I saw your son's file, when I understood what they were going through, I felt like maybe I could be present in a way I wasn't able to be before. Not to redo the past, but to honor it." She paused. "These boys don't need someone to fix them. They need someone to believe they're worth the time and effort. That's all." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. The honesty of it was almost overwhelming. He simply nodded. Amara left the penthouse. Marcus went to check on the boys. Both were asleep, their faces peaceful in a way they rarely were while conscious. He stood in the doorway between their beds and made himself a promise. He was going to do whatever it took to give them what Amara was offering. Presence. Acceptance. Belief. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He took a day off work. He canceled meetings, postponed calls, and blocked his calendar completely. He was going to be present in the penthouse and observe. He wanted to understand more about the dynamic that was forming between Amara and his sons. Amara arrived for work at 7 in the morning, as she always did. She moved through the penthouse with her familiar quiet efficiency. She started in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the boys. Marcus watched from the living room as Daniel and Isaiah came down, drawn by the smell of food. They didn't interact with Amara directly, but they sat at the table where she'd placed plates and glasses. They ate without being asked. This simple compliance would have been impossible weeks ago. After breakfast, Amara suggested, through gesture rather than words, that they go to the living room. The boys followed. She brought out a box of old toys that had been stored in a closet. She didn't make a presentation of them. She simply set the box down and began sorting through it quietly. Daniel approached the box and picked up a toy train. He set it on the floor and began to arrange it methodically. Isaiah picked up a puzzle box and sat on the floor with it. Amara sat nearby, not helping, not directing, simply occupying the same space. Marcus watched from across the room, barely breathing. The quiet industry of it fascinated him. The boys were engaged. Amara was engaged. There was no conflict. There were no demands. Just a shared space where everyone was doing their own thing. 3 hours passed like this. Then Amara suggested lunch through gestures. The boys got up and followed her to the kitchen without resistance. After lunch, Isaiah approached Amara. He didn't speak, but he took her hand and led her to the window that looked out over the city. He pointed at something, a bird flying past the glass. Amara looked at the bird, then she looked at Isaiah. She hummed the melody that had become their shared language. Isaiah's face lit up. He squeezed her hand. It was the first voluntary physical contact Marcus had seen his son initiate with an adult in a decade. Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. He left the room, going to his private office where he closed the door and allowed himself to cry. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief, tears of gratitude for this woman who had walked into their lives and, without fanfare or special techniques or expensive equipment, had simply seen his boys and accepted them. When Marcus composed himself, he returned to the living room. Amara was sitting on the floor with both boys, and they were building something together with blocks. It was an image of such ordinariness and such beauty that Marcus wanted to capture it and keep it forever. That evening, after Amara left, Marcus sat with his sons one more time before bed. He didn't try to force conversation. He simply sat with them, present in his own quiet way. Daniel looked at him and said, slightly unclear but unmistakable, "Dad." It was the first word either boy had spoken to him directly in 10 years. Marcus felt his entire world shift. The boys looked at each other, and Isaiah made a humming sound, almost like laughter. Then both boys curled up on either side of their father. Marcus held them, his arms around them both, and realized that the journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, he could see the horizon. He could see the possibility of his sons finding their way back to language, to connection, to him. He could see the woman who had made it possible, Amara, who had asked only one question during her interview: "Are they good kids?" And when he'd said yes, she'd believed him and had gone about the difficult work of proving it true. The next morning came with the decision Marcus had been contemplating all night. He needed to understand Amara better, not because he didn't trust her, but because he needed to comprehend the depth of what she was offering. He needed to know if her presence could be sustained, if this progress was real, if there was a future in which his boys could heal. He decided to do something he rarely did in his personal life. He investigated, not in a suspicious way, but in a practical way. He had the agency that managed the household staff provide him with more detailed information about Amara. What he found was a story of loss and resilience. She had worked in pediatric care for over a decade. She had been respected and valued. Then something had happened. Some incident that was vaguely referenced but not fully detailed in the files. She had lost her job. There had been a custody battle. She had lost her daughter. There were legal proceedings that she'd ultimately lost. She had rebuilt her life quietly, taking domestic work to survive. But she kept showing up, kept trying, kept moving forward. There was a name that appeared in the files multiple times. A woman named Dr. Helena Cross, who had testified against her in the custody case. A woman who had been her supervisor at the pediatric facility where she'd worked. Marcus understood then that Amara's past was complicated. There were things she hadn't shared. Things that might have been painful, but instead of allowing that past to destroy her, she had chosen to build towards something better. She had chosen to see his sons not as the broken outcomes of trauma, but as children worth investing in. That kind of grace was rare. That kind of commitment was even rarer. Marcus made a decision that evening. He was going to give Amara a permanent position, not just as a maid, but as a full-time caregiver for the boys. He would increase her pay substantially. He would give her benefits, security, stability. More than that, he would give her his trust, which was something he did not offer easily or frequently. When he made the offer the next day, Amara's reaction surprised him. She didn't immediately accept. She asked questions. What does permanent mean? What are the expectations? What if the boys stop progressing? What if I fail? Marcus realized then that she wasn't motivated by money or security. She was motivated by her fear of disappointing the boys, her fear of failing them the way she feared she'd failed her own daughter. That fear, that vulnerability, made her trustworthy in a way that confidence never could. "I'm offering you the position because you're not failing them," Marcus said. "You're doing something extraordinary. But I'm also offering it because I think you need this as much as they do. I think this is where you're supposed to be." Amara was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. She accepted. That night, Marcus sat in his office and looked at the city below. For the first time in a decade, he felt like the life he was living was the real one. The business empire, the money, the status. Those were all secondary now. What mattered was what was happening in this penthouse. What mattered was the slow, fragile progress his sons were making. What mattered was the woman who was making it possible, who had come into their lives and asked only one question. Are they good kids? And having decided they were, had committed herself to proving it true every single day, the boys continued to improve, slowly but measurably. A week after Amara became their permanent caregiver, Isaiah said his first word to Marcus voluntarily, Dad. Another week passed and Daniel asked for water by name. By the third week, both boys were using simple words and phrases. The phrases weren't always clear. The pronunciation wasn't always perfect. But the words were there. The language was returning. More importantly, the connection was growing. The boys started to anticipate Amara's arrival in the morning. They would wake up and ask for her, using her name, which they spoke as Mara. They would follow her from room to room. They would sit with her. They would hum with her. They began almost imperceptibly to become the children they might have been if their mother had lived. Marcus watched this transformation with a kind of amazement that bordered on religious experience. He had believed in money's power. He had believed in expertise and credentials and specialization. But what Amara was offering transcended all of that. She was offering presence. She was offering acceptance. She was offering love without condition or demand. One evening, after a month of Amara working as the permanent caregiver, Marcus found himself alone with her. The boys were asleep. The penthouse was quiet. He asked her the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. What would you tell other people about this? About what happened here? Amara considered the question carefully. She wasn't the type to offer easy answers or platitudes. I would tell them that children who have experienced loss or trauma don't need to be fixed, she said. They need to be witnessed. They need to know that someone sees them, really sees them. Not as problems, not as projects, but as whole human beings who are worthy of love exactly as they are. Marcus understood then that Amara was teaching him something far more profound than how to reach his traumatized sons. She was teaching him how to be the parent they needed, a parent who was willing to sit in silence, a parent who was willing to accept that progress might be invisible, a parent who was willing to believe that his children could heal, even when the world said they were beyond reach. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of both boys calling for him. They were in the kitchen with Amara. She had made pancakes. The boys helped her arrange them on plates. Then they called for their father. Come eat, Daniel said, his pronunciation clearer than it had been weeks ago. Marcus joined them at the table. For the first time in a decade, they had a family meal. The boys didn't speak constantly. There were still long silences. But the silences were comfortable now. They were the silences of connection, rather than disconnection. Amara sat at the table with them, and she was included naturally, as though she had always been part of this family. As Marcus watched his sons eat and engage with each other and occasionally with him, he realized that he had been so focused on fixing what was broken that he had missed the opportunity to simply be present for what was already working. The boys were good, as he had told Amara. They had always been good. They just needed someone to believe it. They needed someone to stop trying to change them and start accepting them. They needed Amara. And in a way that surprised him, Marcus realized they also needed him. Not as a provider of therapy and specialists, but as their father. Present. Accepting. Willing to sit in silence and let them be exactly who they were. The transformation wasn't complete. The boys still had difficult days. They still sometimes retreated into silence. They still sometimes became overwhelmed by sensory input or emotional intensity, but the trajectory had changed. Instead of a flat horizontal line of persistent dysfunction, they were moving forward, upward, toward possibility. And at the center of that movement was Amara, a woman who had walked into their lives with nothing but her quiet presence and her belief that children who had experienced trauma deserved the same dignity and respect as anyone else. That belief, combined with her unwillingness to abandon them when things got difficult, was changing everything. Marcus realized then that he had finally found what no amount of money or expertise could purchase. He had found hope, real hope, the kind that was earned through patience and presence and the simple human act of refusing to give up on someone who needed you. Marcus realized then that he had finally found what no amount of money or expertise could purchase. He had found hope, real hope, the kind that was earned through patience and presence, and the simple human act of refusing to give up on someone who needed you. 2 months into Amara's role as permanent caregiver, Marcus attended a business meeting in the city. It was important. His investment partners needed his attention on a major acquisition. He sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a glass building, surrounded by financial advisors and lawyers. But his mind kept returning to the penthouse, to the boys, to Amara. He was closing a deal worth $50 million when his phone buzzed with a message from the household manager. Something had happened. Please call immediately. Marcus excused himself from the meeting. He stepped into a private room and called the penthouse. The manager answered on the first ring, her voice panicked. The boys had a severe meltdown, both at once. Amara tried to calm them, but something triggered them. She called for emergency services. They're on their way, but I thought you should know. Marcus didn't hesitate. He told his partners he was leaving. He didn't explain. He didn't offer apologies or alternative dates. He simply walked out of the conference room, took the elevator down to the lobby, and called his driver. The penthouse was only 15 minutes away, but it felt like hours. Every second felt charged with the possibility of losing what he had just begun to find. When he arrived home, paramedics were already there. 2 of them were in the living room with Daniel, who was in the middle of a severe sensory overload. The boy was screaming, his entire body rigid. Isaiah was in his bedroom, rocking back and forth, seemingly catatonic. Amara was standing in the hallway, her face pale, her hands trembling. When she saw Marcus, she looked like she might collapse. I don't know what happened, she said. They were fine this morning. We had breakfast together. Then suddenly Daniel started screaming and Isaiah just shut down. One of the paramedics approached Marcus. Your children need immediate evaluation, he said. We recommend taking them to the hospital for assessment. Marcus's first instinct was to refuse, but he saw the severity of their condition and understood that refusal wasn't an option. He nodded. He began packing overnight bags for the boys. Amara moved to help, but one of the paramedics gently suggested she remain at the penthouse. Only immediate family in the ambulance. Marcus felt her eyes on him as he left with his sons. The hospital was a flurry of activity. Tests were ordered. Specialists were called. After 3 hours of observation and examination, a psychiatrist sat down with Marcus in a consultation room. Your sons are experiencing acute anxiety episodes, the doctor explained. Their levels of distress are consistent with severe trauma response. Has anything changed recently? Marcus considered the question carefully. There had been changes, massive changes. The boys were speaking. They were engaging. They were connected to someone who cared for them. But all of that was recent, and perhaps too much change too quickly. I hired a new caregiver 2 months ago, Marcus said. The boys have made significant progress. But maybe the changes were too much. Maybe they need time to adjust. The doctor made notes. I would recommend continuing with whoever is working with them, the doctor said. But also recommend a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The good news is that acute episodes like this often pass with proper support and stability. They may need medication to help manage anxiety, but let's start with behavioral supports. Marcus sat in the hospital room that night, listening to his sons breathe in their sedated sleep. He felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had hired Amara. He had believed in her. He had allowed her to become central to the boys' lives. And now they were in the hospital, their progress apparently fragile, their condition more serious than he had realized. When morning came, Marcus called Amara. He needed to hear her voice. He needed her perspective. She answered on the first ring. How are they? She asked immediately. Stable, Marcus said. They're sleeping. The doctor thinks it might be medication side effects or just the intensity of recent changes. I don't know. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. It's not your fault. Whatever happened, it's not because of what we've been doing. Change is hard for children who have experienced trauma. Sometimes they regress before they progress further. It doesn't mean we're going backward. It means we're hitting the next level of healing." Marcus wasn't sure if he believed her, but he wanted to. He wanted to trust that this setback was part of the process, rather than a sign that he'd made a terrible mistake. When the boys were released from the hospital 2 days later, they were on a mild anti-anxiety medication. The psychiatrist recommended therapy to help them process whatever had triggered the meltdown. Marcus arranged for a therapist to come to the penthouse 3 times a week. He also took a step back from most of his business responsibilities. He canceled non-essential meetings. He delegated more authority to his partners. His presence, he decided, was more important than his portfolio. When he brought the boys home, Amara was waiting. She had cleaned the penthouse. She had prepared meals. She had made everything comfortable and familiar. When the boys saw her, their faces lit up with a recognition that went beyond relief. It was recognition of safety, recognition of home. Daniel ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Isaiah followed, pressing against her side. Amara held them both, and over their heads, she met Marcus's eyes. In her gaze was something Marcus recognized: commitment. Not contractual commitment, but something deeper. She had become the boy's mother in every way that mattered. And Marcus had become something too. He had become a father. A real father. Not one who tried to fix things through money and expertise, but one who was willing to be present in the mess of human connection. Over the next month, with medication and therapy and Amara's consistent presence, the boys began to stabilize again. The panic episodes decreased in frequency. Their speech continued to improve. They started to use more complex sentences. They began to ask questions about their mother, which was progress of a different kind. They were moving beyond survival into curiosity, into connection with the past while building a future. One afternoon, Marcus was in his office working on business matters when he overheard a conversation between the boys and Amara in the living room. Isaiah was asking, "Did Mommy like to sing?" Amara responded, "Yes. Your mother loved to sing. She was very beautiful and very kind." Daniel asked, "Will we forget her?" Marcus set down his work. He moved to the doorway where he could see them but remain unseen. Amara was sitting between the boys on the sofa. "No," she said. "You won't forget her. But the pain of missing her will become smaller. You'll remember her with love, instead of just pain." The boys seemed satisfied with this answer. They leaned against Amara, and she pulled them close. Marcus felt tears on his face. Amara was teaching them something he couldn't teach them alone. She was teaching them how to hold loss and love together, how to remember without being destroyed by remembrance. She was teaching them resilience through her own example, because Marcus knew then, beyond doubt, that Amara had lost her own daughter, and she was using that loss to help his sons heal. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Marcus found Amara in the kitchen preparing vegetables for the next day's meals. He closed the door behind him, and she looked up, understanding that this was a different kind of conversation. "Tell me about your daughter," Marcus said. Amara set down her knife. Her hands were still, but Marcus could see the tremor in them. "Her name was Sophie," Amara said. "She would be 23 now. I lost custody of her when she was 5 years old. There was an incident at the pediatric clinic where I worked. A child was injured. I was blamed. There was an investigation. I lost my job. My ex-partner used it against me in the custody case. I lost my daughter." The words were stark, raw. Amara continued, "I spent years trying to rebuild myself, trying to understand what happened and whether it was truly my fault. I went to therapy. I worked different jobs. I tried to regain custody, but the damage was done. Then I saw the posting for this job, and I understood that maybe the path forward wasn't about reclaiming the past. Maybe it was about doing better in the present. Maybe it was about honoring the loss by being fully present for children who needed me." Marcus moved closer to her. He reached out and placed his hand on hers. "You're an extraordinary person," he said. "I don't think you understand how much you've changed our lives." Amara looked at him. For just a moment, there was something in her eyes that went beyond professional connection, something that suggested she had come to care for this family in a way that transcended employment. But she looked away. She pulled her hand back gently and returned to her task of preparing vegetables. "I should finish this," she said. "The boys like fresh vegetables with dinner." Marcus nodded. He understood that some boundaries needed to be maintained, but he also understood that something had shifted between them. They were no longer in a simple employer-employee relationship. They had become something more complex, a family, and families, by definition, were complicated. 3 more months passed. The boys continued to progress. Their speech was clearer. Their confidence was growing. They started asking questions about school. They wanted to engage with the world beyond the penthouse. Marcus began researching schools that specialized in supporting children with sensory processing differences and trauma histories. He found one, a small private school that emphasized individual progress over standardized achievement, a place where children were accepted exactly as they were while being gently encouraged to grow. He arranged a visit with the boys and Amara. When they arrived at the school, both Daniel and Isaiah were nervous. Their hands gripped Amara's, and she walked between them slowly, calmly, without pushing. The headmaster, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, greeted them in her office. She didn't try to engage the boys directly. She spoke to Marcus about the school's philosophy, while the boys observed her, slowly acclimating to her presence and the space. After 30 minutes, Daniel approached one of the bookshelves in the office. He pulled out a book about birds and looked at Dr. Chen. She simply smiled and said, "That's a good one. My favorite part is on page 12. Daniel opened to page 12 and looked at the pictures. After a few more minutes, Isaiah made a humming sound. "Doctor," Chen hummed back. The melody of connection had preceded the boys to this place too. By the end of the visit, both boys seemed calm, interested, open. Dr. Chen turned to Marcus. "I think they would do well here," she said. "But more importantly, they seem to have someone very important with them." She looked at Amara with clear recognition of her role. "How long have you been working with them?" 5 months, Amara said. "They've come so far," Dr. Chen said. "Whatever you're doing is working." The boys started school the following week. Amara accompanied them, staying in the background to support their transition but gradually allowing them to become more independent. The first few days were challenging. There were moments of anxiety and resistance, but by the end of the first week, both boys were engaging in classroom activities and making tentative connections with other students. Marcus attended a meeting with the school to discuss their progress. Dr. Chen reported that Daniel had participated in a math activity. Isaiah had sung in a music circle. Both were eating lunch in the cafeteria with support, but without major distress. The progress was real. It was sustainable. It was exactly what Marcus had hoped for when he first hired Amara. But it had required far more than he initially understood. It had required her to be willing to be vulnerable. It had required her to transform her own grief into fuel for healing. It had required her to believe that broken things could become whole again. One evening, as they sat together watching the boys play in the living room, Marcus made a decision. He turned to Amara and said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Amara looked at him, waiting. "Will you be part of this family? Not as an employee, as family, as someone who is permanently, legally, officially part of our lives?" Amara's eyes filled with tears. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know what that would mean for me?" Marcus nodded. "It would mean claiming something you weren't sure you deserved. It would mean opening yourself to loss again. It would mean trusting that this is real and permanent. Yes, I know. But I also know that my sons wouldn't have voices if you hadn't believed they could. I also know that I wouldn't be a father without you showing me what that really means. And I know that you belong here, with us. That's not an employment decision. That's a family decision." Amara stood up. She walked to the window where the city lights spread out below them. For a long time, she didn't speak. When she did, her words came slowly. "I'd given up on the idea of belonging anywhere," she said. "I thought I had forfeited the right to be part of a family. But you and these boys have shown me that second chances exist. That grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. That broken people can build whole lives together. She turned to face him. Yes, I want to be part of this family, whatever that means. Marcus stood and pulled her into an embrace. It was the first time he had touched her outside of a professional context. It felt momentous. It felt like the completion of something that had been building since the day she walked into their lives and asked only one question. Are they good kids? The legal process of adoption was complex but manageable with the right attorneys. Amara worked with Marcus to navigate the paperwork, the interviews, the home studies. No one questioned the arrangement. The evidence of her care for the boys was irrefutable. By the end of 3 months, the adoption was finalized. Amara went from employee to family member, from caregiver to mother. The boys called her mom now instead of just her name. The transformation was complete. To celebrate, Marcus arranged something special. He rented a house for a week on a quiet beach far from the city. Just the 4 of them. No staff, no interruptions, just family. The first morning, they walked along the sand. The boys ran ahead, their laughter carrying on the wind. Amara walked beside Marcus, their hands close, occasionally brushing. It was a simple moment, an ordinary family moment, but for both of them, it represented everything they had fought to achieve. That evening, as the sun set over the water, Daniel asked Marcus a question. Why did you bring us here? Marcus considered the question carefully. To celebrate, he said. To mark the fact that we're a family. To give us a chance to just be together without the pressure of the city. To say thank you. To whom? Daniel asked. To Amara. To you. To Isaiah. To the universe for bringing us all together. Daniel nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Isaiah, who had been building a sandcastle, looked up and smiled. Marcus had never seen his son smile with such freedom, such lack of constraint. The healing was real. The transformation was complete. But Marcus also understood that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice. Every day would require them to show up for each other. Every day would offer challenges and opportunities for growth. But they would face those days together, as a family. On the last night of their beach vacation, Marcus sat with Amara while the boys slept in the adjacent room. They could hear the sound of ocean waves through the open windows. The air was warm and salt-scented. Amara leaned against his shoulder. I need to tell you something, Marcus said. Okay, Amara responded. I've been approached by someone representing my ex-business partner. They want me to rejoin the company. They're offering me a significant role, a massive salary increase, an opportunity to expand operations internationally. Marcus paused. And? Amara prompted. And I turned them down. Amara lifted her head to look at him. Why? Because this matters more, Marcus said, gesturing toward the room where the boys slept. Being present for my sons. Being present for you. Building a life that's based on connection rather than accumulation. I spent 20 years trying to make more money, gain more power, expand my empire, and I missed everything that actually mattered. I'm not making that mistake again. Amara took his hand. I'm proud of you, she said simply. That night, Marcus slept the deepest sleep he'd had in a decade. He dreamed of his son speaking, laughing, growing. He dreamed of a woman who had walked into their lives as a stranger and become the foundation of their family. He dreamed of second chances and redemption and the transformative power of simply showing up for the people you love. When they returned to the city, life continued in its new shape. The boys thrived in school. They continued therapy, which helped them process their early trauma. They made friends. They sang in the school choir. They participated in activities and sports. They were, in every meaningful way, becoming children instead of surviving trauma. Amara continued her work as their mother and caregiver, but she also began volunteering at a pediatric advocacy center. She worked with other families navigating trauma and loss. She used her experience to help them understand that healing was possible, that broken things could become whole, that children who had experienced pain could still laugh and grow and love. Marcus restructured his business life. He brought in partners who shared his values. He stepped back from the relentless pursuit of profit and reinvested in companies and causes that aligned with his beliefs. He still made money. His empire didn't collapse, but it was no longer the center of his life. That center now belonged to his family. 2 years after Amara had first walked into the penthouse and asked if the boys were good kids, Marcus stood in a large conference room. He was giving a presentation to a group of educators and mental health professionals. The topic was trauma-informed parenting, the role of presence in healing, the fallacy of trying to fix children who had experienced loss. On the screen behind him were pictures of Daniel and Isaiah, recent pictures, the boys laughing, the boys singing, the boys being exactly who they were meant to be. Marcus spoke about his journey, about how he had initially believed that expertise and money could solve the problem of his son's silence, about how he had learned that what they needed was simpler and more profound. They needed presence. They needed acceptance. They needed someone willing to sit with them in their pain without trying to change it. He spoke about Amara without using her full name, preserving her privacy. But he described her role in absolute terms. She saved our family, he said, not through specialized training or credentials or therapeutic techniques. She saved us through her willingness to show up every single day and see our children exactly as they were, to accept them, to believe in them. When he finished speaking, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap. Others joined. The applause grew. Marcus saw people wiping tears. He understood then that his story was resonating because it spoke to a universal truth. Everyone longed to be seen. Everyone longed to be accepted. Everyone longed for someone to believe in their capacity to heal. After the presentation, Marcus was approached by a woman. She introduced herself as the director of a national child advocacy organization. She asked if he would consider establishing a scholarship fund to support family advocates like Amara, people with lived experience of trauma who could bring empathy and understanding to families navigating similar struggles. Marcus agreed without hesitation. Within 6 months, the foundation was established. Within a year, 50 families had been supported by advocates trained in trauma-informed care. Within 2 years, the model had expanded to 5 states. Amara eventually became the director of the program, not through business credentials but through her clear understanding of what families needed, her lived experience, her commitment to healing. When Amara's daughter Sophie reached out to her after 9 years of separation, it was through a social media message. "I saw your foundation," Sophie wrote. "I followed your work. I wanted to reach out. I'm sorry it took me so long." Amara read the message 3 times before showing Marcus. She was crying, happy tears and sad tears mixed together. She called Sophie immediately. The phone call lasted 2 hours. It was awkward at first. There were years of separation to navigate. There was pain that needed to be acknowledged. But underneath it all was a thread of love that had never quite been severed. They agreed to meet. Sophie flew to the city. The reunion took place in Marcus's office, neutral ground where Amara could feel supported, but where Sophie could also feel like she was entering her mother's world on her own terms. When Sophie walked in, Amara stood. She didn't rush forward. She waited. Sophie walked to her mother, and they embraced. For nearly 5 minutes, neither spoke. They just held each other. When they finally sat down, Sophie looked at her mother directly. "I read about the foundation," Sophie said. "I read about what you've done. I understand why you lost custody now. Not because you were bad, but because the system wasn't designed to protect people like us. I understand why you had to rebuild yourself, and I'm proud of you." Amara couldn't speak. She reached for her daughter's hand. Sophie squeezed back. Over the following months, Amara and Sophie began rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't the same as it had been when Sophie was 5. It couldn't be. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. But it was real. It was genuine. It was built on adult understanding rather than child dependency. Sophie began spending time at the penthouse. She met Daniel and Isaiah. They were curious about their connection to her. Amara explained that Sophie was her daughter, that families came in different shapes and sizes, that love didn't always follow the expected timeline. The boys seemed to understand at some instinctive level. They treated Sophie with the same openness and trust they showed their mother. On Sophie's birthday, the family gathered at the penthouse. Marcus had arranged a dinner catered by her favorite restaurant. Sophie sat between Amara and Marcus while the boys decorated the space with drawings they had made for her. It was a simple celebration, but it represented something extraordinary. A family that had been broken was becoming whole. A woman who had lost custody of her child was rebuilding that relationship on new terms. A man who had failed as a father was learning to succeed through humility and presence. And two boys who hadn't spoken a word were now engaging fully with the world and the people they loved. As they sang happy birthday and Sophie blew out her candles, Marcus looked around the table and understood something fundamental. Healing wasn't about returning to what had been before. That was impossible. Healing was about building something new, something stronger, something that incorporated loss and grief and trauma, but refused to be defined by them. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the boys were asleep, Marcus stood on the balcony of the penthouse looking out at the city. Amara joined him. They stood in silence, watching the light spread out before them. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. "Regret what? Regret leaving your job to care for my sons? Regret giving up your career to take a chance on a stranger and his broken family?" Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "Number. I regret the years I spent not doing this. I regret the time I wasted trying to run from my past instead of transforming it into something meaningful. But this? Number. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marcus took her hand. "I'm grateful every day," he said. "For you. For seeing something in my sons that no one else could see. For believing in them when I was losing faith. For choosing to stay when you could have left." Amara squeezed his hand. "We saved each other," she said. "You gave me a reason to believe in second chances. Your sons gave me purpose. I gave them voice. That's what family is. It's people who save each other. Again and again." They stood together in the darkness, two people who had faced loss and trauma, and somehow emerged on the other side. Not unscathed, but whole, connected, transformed by the simple act of choosing to believe in each other. The years that followed were marked by growth and connection. The boys excelled academically. They developed talents and interests. Daniel became passionate about environmental science. Isaiah discovered a love of music and began to learn piano. They developed friendships. They experienced the normal challenges of adolescence. They moved through the world with confidence and grace. Sophie became a regular presence in their lives. She pursued psychology in college, driven by her desire to help other families navigate trauma. She often worked with her mother at the foundation. The two of them traveled to different cities, training other advocates, sharing their story, helping other families understand that healing was possible. Marcus eventually stepped back from his role at the foundation's board. Not because he wasn't committed, but because he had learned the importance of knowing when to let others lead. Amara was the leader this organization needed. Her vision was clear. Her commitment was unwavering. His role became more personal. He was a father, a husband in everything but name, a family man. He still conducted business, but it was business that mattered. Companies that created positive impact. Investments in communities rather than just wealth accumulation. His life had transformed from one of constant striving to one of intentional presence. On a quiet evening 5 years after Amara had first walked into the penthouse, Marcus found himself thinking about that initial interview. The question he had asked about her qualifications, her simple response. "Are they good kids?" "Yes," he had answered. And because he had answered yes, because she had believed him, everything had changed. The boys were 17 now, nearly adults. They were preparing for college. They had plans and dreams and possibilities that seemed almost limitless. They had found their voices not just literally, but figuratively. They were expressing themselves, making choices, becoming who they were meant to be. And at the center of it all was a woman who had walked into their lives with nothing but her quiet presence and her belief that children deserved to be seen. That trauma didn't define capacity, that love was the strongest healing force available to humanity. On a weekend afternoon, the entire family gathered at the beach house they had purchased years ago. Marcus and Amara, had gotten legally married 3 years prior in a simple ceremony, with just family present. Sophie had been Amara's maid of honor. Daniel and Isaiah had stood beside their father. It had been perfect in its simplicity. Now, watching the family spread across the beach, Marcus felt a completeness that he had never known was possible. Sophie walked along the shoreline with her mother. They were deep in conversation, the kind of connection that had seemed impossible when they first reunited. The boys played in the water, their laughter carrying on the wind. They were comfortable. They were confident. They were loved. Marcus sat on the porch of the beach house, watching them all. Amara came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how much has changed. About how I could have missed all of this if I hadn't hired you. About how grateful I am that you walked into our lives." Amara smiled. "Sometimes I think about that first day," she said. "I was so scared. I was trying to prove something, trying to rebuild my sense of self-worth by being useful to someone else's family. I didn't expect to actually become family. I didn't expect to find healing for myself by helping your sons heal." "That's the thing about love," Marcus said. "It's not finite. It doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies." Amara turned to face him. She kissed him softly. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Marcus replied. "And I love our family, whatever shape it takes, however it came together, whatever it becomes next." That night, they sat around a fire on the beach. The boys shared stories about school and their plans for the future. Sophie talked about a research opportunity she had been offered. Amara spoke about a new training program they were launching at the foundation. Marcus listened. He had learned the power of listening, of bearing witness to the lives of the people he loved, of not needing to have all the answers or control all the outcomes. He had learned that the greatest gift he could give was his presence. As the fire died down and the night grew quiet, Daniel suddenly said something. He said, "I remember when I first started speaking. I remember how scared I was, how hard it felt to let sound come out of my mouth. But I remember knowing that it was safe because Amara was there, that she wasn't trying to make me be anyone other than who I was. She just believed I could do it, and so I did." Marcus felt tears on his face. He looked at Amara. She was crying too. Isaiah added, "She's the reason I'm here, the reason I'm not still locked inside where no one could reach me. She's my mom." He said it matter-of-factly, as though it was the most obvious truth in the world. Because it was. Amara had become their mother through choice and commitment and the daily practice of showing up. That was more real than any biological connection. That was family in its truest form. As the evening ended and they made their way inside, Marcus held Amara's hand. He squeezed it gently, a gesture of gratitude and love and acknowledgement of everything they had built together. She squeezed back. In that simple exchange was contained an entire story. A story of loss and trauma, and the courage to believe in second chances. A story of a woman who had been broken by circumstances but refused to let that breakage define her. A story of a man who had learned that power and money were meaningless without connection. A story of two boys who had found their voices not through therapy or specialists, but through the simple presence of someone who believed they had something to say. Years later, when the boys had grown into men and were building their own lives, when Sophie had become a recognized expert in trauma-informed care, when the foundation had helped hundreds of families, people would ask Marcus about the decision that had changed everything. They would ask what made him hire Amara, what made him believe in her when her resume was modest and her references were limited. Marcus would always give the same answer. "I didn't hire her based on qualifications," he would say. "I hired her because of how she answered one question. I asked if she thought my sons were good kids. And she said yes. She said it without hesitation. She said it like she believed it with her entire being, and once she said yes, once she committed to that belief, everything else became possible." That's what I learned. That the most important hiring decision I ever made wasn't about finding an expert. It was about finding someone who was willing to believe. Because belief, real belief in a person's capacity to grow and heal and become who they're meant to be, that belief is transformative. That belief is what saves people. I had all the money and power in the world, Marcus would conclude. But I couldn't save my sons. I couldn't save myself. I needed her. I needed her to believe. And because she did, we all became whole. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.